I was the one who heard them come back. That is not a thing I am proud of, and it is not a thing I am ashamed of either. It is only a fact, the way the cold of the deep galleries is a fact, the way the long stare down to the listening hall is a fact. I was old then. I am older now. But I had the ears for it, and the patience, and the kind of memory that does not let go. So when the Archon Vanguard of the Ozrai broke from the dark above us, and lit the dead sky over the world they had murdered, it was my hand on the dial that found their voices first. You have to understand what the surface was in those years before they returned. We had not lived up there in a very long time. The sundering had taken it from us 200,000 years before I was born, and 200,000 years before that, and so on back into a depth of time that the human mind does not so much understand as carry. The way you carry a stone in your boot for a march, so long you forget the boot was ever empty. The Ozrai had come the first time when our ancestors still walked under an open sky. They had looked at that sky and at the people beneath it, and they had decided that the world would be more useful to them scoured clean. So they scoured it. They cracked the crust along its old seams. They burned the air until the air would no longer hold a flame. They salted the seas and turned the green places to glass, and then they left, satisfied, the way a man is satisfied when he has finished a chore he found distasteful. They did not stay to watch us die. That was their first mistake, though they would not learn it was a mistake for 200,000 years. They assumed we would die because everything dies when you take its air and its water and its light. They were not wrong about the everything. They were only wrong about the us. We went down. That is the whole of it in 3 words, and it is also the largest thing a species has ever done. We went down into the bones of the planet, into the old magma channels gone cold, into the salt domes and the deep aquifers and the long blind faults, and we did not go down as refugees. I want that understood because the story gets told sometimes as if we were beggars who crawled into a hole to weep. We were beggars. We did crawl. But somewhere in the first 100 generations of crawling, while the surface above us froze into a white silence that would last longer than any human language, a decision got made that was never written down in any single place because it did not need to be. The decision was this: we would not be a grave. Whatever else the dark made of us, it would not make us a tomb. We would build in the dark the thing that should have stood in the light. And one day, the ones who put us here would come back to admire their work, and we would be standing in the room when they arrived. My grandmother used to say that the first builders did not even believe the Archons would return. She said the early records are full of arguments about it, men and women shouting across the listening halls that the enemy was gone for good, that there was no one left to prepare against, that all this labor and discipline was a religion dressed up as a defense. And she said the answer the builders gave was the answer that built everything after. It does not matter whether they come. We prepare as if they will. Because if they never come, we have only made ourselves strong in the dark for nothing, and there are worse fates than that. And if they do come, we will be ready, and they will learn what they made. I joined the Deep Watch when I was 16, which by the reckoning of the underreach made me late. Most went earlier. I had a mother who wanted me in the foundries and a father who wanted me in the water guilds, and I gave them both 2 years of pretending before I walked down the long stair to the recruiting hall myself and signed my name under a creed I had heard since before I could speak. We kept the dark. We kept the memory. We did not become a grave. That was the creed. There were longer versions of it, ceremonial versions full of names and dates, but that was the one a soldier carried. The one you said under your breath on a cold watch when your eyes wanted to close. We kept the dark. We kept the memory. People up here on the surface now, the young ones born since the rising, they think the Deep Watch was about the listening. They picture us hunched over the great arrays in the listening halls, ears to the sky, waiting century after century for the sound of an engine. And we did do that. But the listening was the smallest part of it. The listening was a man with his hand on a dial. The watch was everything behind the man. It was the foundries that ran without stopping for 60,000 years, pouring the hull plate for ships no living builder would ever see fly. It was the drill yards where children learned to seal a breach in the dark by touch alone, where I myself learned it, where my own children learned it. It was the archive, the great cold archive that held every word the Ozrai had ever broadcast in the days of the Sundering, decoded and redecoded and studied, until we knew their grammar better than they did, until we could read the difference between an Ozrai command and an Ozrai prayer, until a watch officer could hear 3 syllables of their speech and tell you the rank of the speaker and the mood he was in. That was the discipline, 200,000 years of it. Not the discipline of a desperate people clawing to stay alive, but the discipline of a patient people who had decided, long ago, exactly what they were going to be when the day came. We were not surviving. Survival was a thing we had finished doing in the first 10,000 years, and after that it was a foundation, not a goal. What we were doing, all those long dark generations, was getting ready. I have heard it said by people who should know better that we got lucky. That the Archons could have come back in the weak years, in those first centuries when we were still a handful of frightened families breathing recycled air in a single flooded gallery, and that if they had, the whole story would have gone the other way. And that is true as far as it goes. We were weak once. I will not pretend otherwise, and the Watch never let us pretend otherwise, because forgetting the weak years was the one unforgivable thing in the Underreach. We kept the records of the weak years on purpose, the ledgers of the famines and the air failures and the gallery collapses, the lists of the dead from the centuries when there were so few of us that every death was a wound to the whole. We kept them so that no generation would ever stand in the new strength and imagine the strength had come for free. But luck did not save us in the weak years. Discipline did. The decision did. The choice made by people who had every reason to give up, to spend their last strength not on comfort but on the future. That is not luck. That is the opposite of luck. That is the hardest thing people can do, and we did it, and we did it for 200,000 years, and I will not have it called luck. I read the records of the weak years more than once because the Watch made us read them, and because after a while I wanted to. There was one I came back to. It was a ledger kept by an Air Guild keeper in the 3rd or 4th thousand year of the dark, a woman whose name does not survive whole, only the first part of it, Ada-something, the rest lost to a damaged page. She kept the tally of the breathing galleries in a flooded reach where perhaps 800 people lived on air that had to be turned by hand through beds of green scum and shallow trays. And the tally is just numbers, day after day, the volume turned, the volume lost, the deaths. You can read the famine coming in the numbers before she writes a word about it. The turned volume holds steady and the population falls, which means the living were turning air for the dead because they did not have the strength to do anything else. And then one day, in the middle of the numbers, with no more ceremony than she gave the air tally, she writes a single line that is not a number. She writes that the keepers met and voted not to eat the seed beds. The seed beds were the green that made the air. They could have eaten them and lived another month and died with full bellies in a gallery that had stopped breathing. They voted not to. They voted to starve a little faster and keep the air turning, for the people who came after who they would never see, and then she goes back to the numbers, and the numbers get smaller, and then the ledger ends. We do not know if Ada lived. We know the air gallery she kept was still breathing 9,000 years later because the Underreach grew up out of it. That is the weak years. That is what was happening in the dark while the surface lay white and silent, and the Ozrai, far away, counted us among the dead, people who had nothing voting in the dark not to eat the future. I have never read that ledger without putting it down for a while, and I am not a soft man. When I was a younger man, I served on the deep arrays under a marshal named Kodal, who was the kind of officer the Watch produced in its best moods, which is to say he was hard and quiet and entirely without vanity. He had a saying he used on the new Watch officers, the ones who came down to the listening halls full of the romance of it, imagining the great moment when the Archons would return, and the Watch would sound, and the deep would rise. Kodal would let them talk, and then he would say, The day they come back, nothing will happen that we have not already done 10,000 times in the dark. He meant it as a discipline. He meant, do not wait for the great day. The great day is just a drill you finally get to run for real, and if you have not run the drill well in the dark, you will not run it well in the light. I did not understand him fully until I was the old man on the watch and the great day came. Then I understood him completely. Nothing happened that we had not already done 10,000 times in the dark. That was the whole of our strength. That was the thing the Archons never imagined, because their own strength had been bought all at once, long ago, with a fleet and a weapon and an afternoon's work, and they had never once in their history had to earn anything slowly. I will tell you about a drill, because the drills are where the watch lived and the surface-born do not understand them. There was a drill called the Dark Seal, and every soldier of the watch ran it until it was in the hands and not the head. They would take a squad into a training gallery and kill the lights, all of them, a black so complete it pressed on the eyes, and then they would open a breach, a real breach, water or pressure or both coming in fast, and you had to seal it by touch alone in the black with the gallery filling, finding the seam and the plate and the lugs by feel, working with men you could not see, and you did it on a count. And if you missed the count, the instructors flooded the gallery to your chest and you did it again. I ran the Dark Seal 1,000 times. I ran it as a recruit at 16 with my hands shaking, and I ran it as an old instructor at 60 teaching it to my own daughter's class. And the thing I learned from it, the thing Codal meant for us to learn from it, was that fear is a thing you drill out through the hands. You cannot reason a man out of fear. But you can put a task in his hands so deep that the hands keep working while the fear does whatever it likes, and after enough years the fear stops bothering to show up, because it has learned the hands will not listen to it. That is what 200,000 years of drills made of us. A people whose hands would not listen to fear. When the Vanguard came back and the deep rose, there were millions of us at our stations, and the records show almost no panic anywhere in the underreach, and the surface-born think that is because we were brave. It was not because we were brave. It was because we had drilled the fear out through the hands, every one of us our whole lives, so that on the day the world turned, our hands kept working, and the fear sat in the corner where it belonged. I should tell you how it began, the return, because the beginning is the part that gets it wrong in the telling. People imagine alarms. They imagine the deep arrays screaming, watch officers running, the great gates grinding open in a roar. It was not like that. The first sign was a change in the texture of the silence. I had been a watch officer once and was something else by then, an old instructor mostly, a man they kept around to tell the young ones how the weak years had felt. But I still took a listening watch when they let me, because the listening hall was where I had spent the best part of my life, and I did not intend to die anywhere else. So I was at the array, on a watch I had no real duty to keep, with my hand on the dial out of 40 years of habit, when the silence changed. The surface had been silent for 200,000 years, not empty silent. There was always the grind of the ice and the long, slow groan of the cracked crust settling, and the thin whistle of the dead wind moving over glass. That was the silence we knew, the silence we had recorded and studied until it was as familiar as a heartbeat. What I heard that night was a wrongness laid over it, a thinning of the high register, the particular hush that comes into the air when something very large is moving through the upper sky and has not yet made a sound. I had never heard it before. No living person had. But I had read the records of the sundering 10,000 times, the way Codal said, and the records described exactly this hush, this thinning, in the words of the watch officers who had died 200,000 years before. And the moment I heard it, the hair stood up on my old arms, and I knew, before any instrument confirmed it, before any voice broke the upper register, that the Ozrai had come back. I did not run. I want that on the record too. I was an old man and I did not run, and not because I was brave, but because there was nowhere to run to, no need to run, nothing to do that running would do. I reached up and I turned the dial that woke the deep arrays, the full arrays, the ones that could hear a whisper in orbit, and I logged the time. And I spoke the words a watch officer speaks, the words I had said in drill 10,000 times. The sky is occupied, the watch is sounded, the deep will rise. And then I sat back in my old chair in the cold listening hall, and I listened to them come. They were not quiet about it once they had landed. That was the first thing the records had taught us, and the first thing the live signals confirmed. The Ozrai did not creep. Why would they creep? They believed they were returning to a tomb. You do not creep into a tomb. You walk in with your lights blazing and your engines loud, and you make your survey, and you plant your markers, and you begin the slow business of taking the dead thing for your own. So they came down through the dead air on their pillars of fire, and they lit the long frozen surface with a light it had not held in 200,000 years, and they began to talk to each other on the open channels, and I sat in the dark below them, and I understood every word. I will not pretend their speech translates cleanly. It does not, and the watch always taught us to distrust the men who claimed it did. The Ozrai do not think the way we think. Their language is built around a notion of rank and inheritance and rightful possession that our words bend out of shape when they try to carry it. But the archive had taught us their grammar in its bones, and I could follow the shape of it, and the shape of it that night was contentment. They were content. They had crossed a gulf of years and arrived to find exactly what they expected: a scoured world, a dead surface, a frozen quiet that confirmed their old work had held. The Vanguard Archon, the one they called Sehun, spoke in the cadence the archive marked as the cadence of a master inspecting a holding, and what he said, as near as our words can carry it, was that the reclamation would proceed on schedule. The surface was confirmed dead. There was nothing here that remembered them. There was nothing here that remembered them. He said that. I logged it. I have read that line in the official record 100 times since, and every time I read it I feel again what I felt in the cold hall that night, which was not anger, though I expected anger, and not triumph, though the young ones think I should have felt triumph. What I felt was a kind of terrible tenderness for the 200,000 years of my people who had spent their whole lives making sure that line was a lie. Every builder in every foundry, every child in every drill yard, every watch officer who had died at this array with his hand on this dial, every name in the long, cold archive of the weak years, all of them had lived and died for the single purpose of making the Vanguard Archon Sehun wrong when he said there was nothing here that remembered. And he was so wrong. He was more wrong than any creature in the history of the world had ever been. He just did not know it yet. I let him talk. We all let him talk. That was the discipline too, and it was the hardest discipline of all, harder than the foundries, harder than the drills. We let the Archon Vanguard land on the grave of our world and begin to plant their markers and run their surveys and speak to each other in the contented cadence of masters returning to a holding. And we did not rise, because rising too soon was a thing we had drilled against for 10,000 years. The deep does not rise to fright. The deep does not rise to posture. The deep rises once fully, when rising will end the matter and not 1 hour before. Kodal taught me that, and his marshal taught it to him, and so on back 200,000 years to the first builders who decided in the dark that when we rose, it would be final. So for 3 days, by the surface reckoning we no longer used but kept in the archive, the Ozrai worked their dead world, and below them the underreach made ready. Not frantically. I have to keep saying that, because the young imagine a frenzy and there was no frenzy. There was the opposite of frenzy. There was a great calm machine, 200,000 years in the building, doing the thing it had been built to do, each part turning to the next part the way the parts of a thing turn when they have been fitted by patient hands over a span of time no single hand could comprehend. The foundries that had poured hull plate for 60,000 years finished their last pour and went cold. The ships that no builder had ever seen fly were brought to their cradles in the great launch galleries, the deep launch galleries that ran up through the crust, along the old magma channels to the surface seams that had been kept clear, and kept secret for longer than the Archons had been gone. The arrays that had listened for 200,000 years turned from listening to seeing, mapping every vessel of the Vanguard, every marker they planted, every channel they used, until the deep knew the surface above it better than the Archon standing on it did. And the people. I keep talking about machines because machines are easier to talk about, but the Underreach was not a machine. It was people, millions of them, more of them than had walked the open earth before the sundering, living their whole lives in galleries that ran for thousands of kilometers through the warm, deep crust, in cities lit by the long-tamed heat of the planet's own heart, in a civilization that had grown so far beyond the one the Archons murdered that the Archons would not have recognized it as the same species, would not have recognized it as a species at all, would have taken it if they had seen it. For something the dead world had grown on its own after they left, like mold in a sealed jar. The people did not panic in those 3 days. The people did what the Underreach had always done. They went to their stations. The drill yards emptied into the launch galleries. The water guilds and the air guilds and the foundry guilds folded down their long peacetime labors and took up the wartime labors they had practiced for 10,000 years and never once performed. Children too young for stations were taken deep, to the deepest galleries, the way they had been taken in every drill of their short lives, and they went without crying, because the going had been made ordinary on purpose, so that on the one day it was not a drill it would feel like a drill anyway, and no child would learn fear from it. That is the thing the surface-born never quite believe when I tell them, that the great day, the day the world turned, felt to most of the Underreach like a drill they had run 1,000 times. That is what readiness is. Readiness is when the largest day of your civilization's life feels like a Tuesday. We had spent 200,000 years making the end of the world into a Tuesday, so that when it came, our hands would not shake. I went down myself on the second day to the great launch gallery under the listening halls, because an old man at an array cannot help wanting to see the thing he has listened for his whole life take shape. I had no business there, and they let me come anyway. I will not forget it. The launch gallery was a channel an old magma flow had cut up through the crust toward the surface seam, kilometers of it, and we had worked it for 60,000 years into a throat lined with cradles, and in the cradles stood the ships. I had known the ships were large. Everyone in the Underreach knew the ships were large. The foundry tally was a thing children learned. But knowing the tally is not the same as standing under a hull that runs away from you into the dark in both directions until the worklights cannot find the end of it, plate fitted to plate by the hands of men dead 40,000 years, the seams of their weld still holding, still true. The foundry crews were doing the last things to them, the small things, the way you do the small things to a tool the morning you finally use it. There was no shouting. There was the sound of the deep, the long warm breath of the planet's heart that lit our cities, and under it the small precise sounds of people who had practiced this morning 10,000 times. A crew chief saw me, an old man gawking where he did not belong, and she did not run me off. She put a hand on the cold hull beside her and she said, "My grandmother's grandmother poured this one." She said it the way you would name a child. Then she went back to her work. That was the Underreach in the days before the Rising. People doing the last small things to ships their ancestors had poured, nomming the dead who poured them, while above us the Archons planted markers in the grave they thought they had made. And the people went to their stations. The water guilds opened the deep reservoirs that fed the launch channels and the cooling of the great arrays, reservoirs filled over millennia against exactly this draw. The air guilds, the inheritors of Ada and her seed beds, sealed the breathing galleries into their wartime cycles, and not one gallery failed in the days that followed, not one, which is its own quiet monument to the people who voted in the dark not to eat the future. The drill yards emptied into the launch galleries and the array posts, and the children too young for stations were taken deep, the way they had been taken in every drill of their short lives, down to the warm, deep galleries where the old people waited for them, and they went without crying, carrying the small things they were allowed to carry, because the going had been made ordinary on purpose. I have heard the surface-born marvel that the children did not cry. The children did not cry, because we had spent 200,000 years making sure they would not have to. On the third day, the Vanguard Archon gave the order to begin the deep survey. I knew it would come. The archive had taught us the rhythm of an Ozrai reclamation, and the deep survey always came on the third day, after the surface was confirmed and the markers were planted. The deep survey was the part where they sent their instruments down into the crust to find what minerals and what cavities the dead world held, so they could plan the long work of stripping it. They expected to find empty rock. They expected to find the cold magma channels and the salt domes and the deep aquifers, all the places we had gone, and to find them empty, the way you expect to find a tomb empty of anything but bone. When their instruments reached down into the crust on the third day, they found the underreach. They found the warm galleries and the lit cities and the great launch channels and the ships in their cradles. They found us, and the contented cadence in their speech broke for the first time in 200,000 years. I was at the array when it broke. I had not left it in 3 days. They had brought me food and let me stay, partly out of respect for an old instructor and partly, I think, because the watch officers wanted someone in the hall who had read every record of the sundering and could tell them whether the live signals matched the dead ones. So I was there, with my hand on the dial, when the deep survey of the Archon Vanguard reached down and touched the thing we had spent 200,000 years becoming, and I heard the moment their certainty died. It did not die all at once. That is one of the things I most remember, that it died slowly in stages, the way a strong man dies. First there was confusion, a flurry of crosstalk in the cadence the archive marked as instrument fault, because of course their first thought was that the readings were wrong. No survey had ever returned readings like these. The obvious answer was a broken instrument. They ran the survey again. They got the same impossible answer. The worm worked deep, the cities, the channels, and they ran it a third time, and a fourth. And each time the answer came back the same, and I sat in the dark and listened to the cadence shift. Instrument fault giving way to something the archive had a mark for but no clean word. A cadence that came into Ozrai speech only in the records of disasters. The cadence of a master discovering that the holding he came to claim is not empty and never was. I should say something here about what the Ozrai are, because the surface-born picture them as men in armor, and that is the one thing they are not. The archive taught us their biology as carefully as it taught us their grammar, because the watch held that you cannot read a mind whose body you do not understand. They are a long-lived people, longer lived than us by a great deal, and they inherit. That is the center of them. An Ozrai does not so much have a life as hold a place in a line, and the line holds places, and the holdings pass down, and an Ozrai mind is built first and last around the idea that what its ancestors took it keeps, and what its ancestors judged it trusts. This is their strength and it was their ruin, because the Vanguard Archon did not merely have to accept, on the third day, that a survey reading was strange. He had to accept that an ancestor of his, 200,000 years dead, an ancestor whose judgment the whole structure of his mind was built to trust, had made an error, and that the error had been compounding in the dark for the entire span of his people's memory, and that he, Sehun, was the one holding the line at the moment the error came due. Our minds break differently than theirs. A human can be wrong about a thing and shrug and be wrong about it and go on. An Ozrai inheriting a 200,000-year-old wrongness from an ancestor he was built to trust is a creature being unmade from the inside. And I heard it happen, syllable by precise syllable, in the cold listening hall, and there was a part of me, the part the watch had trained, that was simply taking the measurement, and there was another part, the older part, that almost felt for him. And then Sehun spoke, and the deep arrays caught his voice clean, and I will carry the sound of it to my pyre. He did not shout. The Ozrai do not shout in the moment of true fear. The archive had taught us that, and the live signal confirmed it. They go very precise. Sehun's voice went very precise, every syllable cut clean, and he ordered the survey halted, and a full scan run of the entire crust beneath the Vanguard, the whole crust, not just the survey grid, and his people ran it, and the deep arrays caught the data stream as it came back to them, and I watched the watch officers around me go still as the scope of it landed on the Archon ships above, because the scope of it was the entire crust. We were not a pocket of survivors in a cavern. We were not a hidden remnant in a salt dome. We were the planet. The underreach ran through the whole of the deep earth, pole to pole, a worked and living world inside the dead one, and the scan that Sehun ordered showed him the whole of it at once, and there is no record in 200,000 years of Ozrai signals of an Ozrai mind receiving a fact that large. The deep rose then, not because the Archons had found us, though they had. We rose because the finding meant the matter could now be ended, and the deep rises once fully, when rising will end the matter. The order to rise did not come from any panic, and it did not come from any single voice. It came from the calm machine, doing the next thing it had always been built to do. The great gates that had been kept clear and kept secret along the old surface seams for longer than the Archons had been gone, they opened, and the underreach came up into the light. I did not see it with my eyes. I was deep at the array, an old man at his station. But the arrays let me see it the way I had learned to see, in signals and in data, and through that I saw it more completely than any pair of eyes on the surface could have. I saw the launch galleries open along 10,000 kilometers of the old seams at once, in a sequence drilled 10,000 times, never once performed now perfectly. I saw the ships rise, the ships no builder had lived to see fly, kilometers of hull plate poured across 60,000 years, lifting on the tamed heat of the planet's heart, rising up through the cracked crust the Archons had made and out into the dead sky the Archons had made, and turning their faces to the Archon ships. I saw the defense arrays come up out of the ice, the great arrays we had built into the deep and slept for 200,000 years, waking now, their barrels and their lenses turning to the sky. I saw the surface of the murdered world, for the first time in 200,000 years, fill with the works of the people who had been told there was nothing there that remembered. I have tried since to make the surface-born understand the scale of it, and I have mostly failed, because the words we have were made for a smaller world. There were more than 900 launch seams, and they opened along the old fault lines that ran the whole skin of the planet, so that to the Archons in their ships above, the dead gray-white world they had been surveying must have seemed to crack open all at once along every old wound the sundering had left in it. And out of every wound came light, and out of the light came the ships, rising on the heat of the planet's own heart, turned at last from warming our cities to lifting our fleet. The defense arrays came up out of the ice that had buried them, the great deep arrays we had built into the crust over 100,000 years, and slept and tended, and never woken, their lenses clearing themselves of 200,000 years of frost as they rose, turning their faces up. I had spent my life with my hand on a listening dial, learning to see the world in signals, and I saw the rising in signals, the whole choreography of it, every ship reporting its station as it cleared the seam, every array reporting its lock as it cleared the ice, 10,000 voices saying the calm, flat words of a drill run perfectly, and I understood that the surface above me, the dead surface my whole people had been told was a grave, was at that moment more alive with our works than the open earth had ever been before the Ozrai burned it. We had not merely come back to the world. We had outgrown the world they murdered. The thing rising into the dead sky was larger and stronger and more disciplined than anything that world had carried in the days of the open air, and it had been built in the dark, by hands that never saw the sky, for a day none of them lived to see. And I heard in the high register the sound the records of the sundering had described and that no living person had ever heard, the sound of an Ozrai fleet realizing it has made a mistake. It is not a loud sound. That is the thing about it. It is the cadence going precise, and then more precise, and then so precise it is barely a cadence at all, the speech of minds doing arithmetic they do not want the answer to. Sehun's vanguard had come with the strength to scour a dead world, the strength that had been enough 200,000 years before, the strength they had bought all at once long ago and never had to earn again. And they ran the arithmetic, ship against ship, array against array, the works of an afternoon 200,000 years gone against the works of 200,000 years of patient hands, and the arithmetic gave them an answer, and the answer was that they were already dead if we wished them dead. They had not fired a shot. We had not fired a shot. The arithmetic did not require a shot. The arithmetic was simply the truth of what each side was, laid against the other, and it had only one answer, and the Vanguard Archon Sehun was precise enough to read it. He sent a signal then to his ships, and the deep arrays caught it, and I heard it, and it is the signal the title of this telling is named for, the final signal of the Archon Vanguard, though I did not know that night that it would be the last thing of importance he ever broadcast. He ordered his ships to hold, not to fire, not to flee, to hold. It was, the archive later confirmed, an order without precedent in the records of the Ozrai. They had a cadence for attack, and a cadence for withdrawal, and a cadence for the slow, contented work of reclamation. But they had no proper cadence for hold and do nothing in the presence of a greater power, because in their long, arrogant history, they had never once been the lesser power. And so Sehun had to improvise the cadence, build it out of fragments, and the arrays caught the seams in it, the places where his speech strained against a situation his language had never been built to carry. I had spent 40 years learning to hear the mood behind the cadence. The mood behind that improvised cadence was the oldest mood there is. It was the mood of a creature that has just understood it is going to die, unless something it has no right to expect chooses to spare it. We could have ended them. I want that understood with the same force I want everything else understood, because it is the center of the whole matter. We could have ended the Archon Vanguard in the first hour of the rising, before Sehun even finished his improvised order to hold. The arithmetic was that lopsided. 200,000 years against an afternoon. We had the ships and the arrays and the angles, all of it drilled, all of it ready, and there were voices in the high command who wanted to use them, and I will not pretend there were not, because the urge was honest and it was old, and it went back 200,000 years to the burning sky and the salted seas and the long white silence of the surface above the weak years. There were people in the underreach, good people, who had spent their whole lives keeping the memory of what the Ozrai did, and who looked up at the Archon Vanguard hanging in our reclaimed sky, and felt that the only just thing was to do to the Archons what the Archons had done to the world. I felt some of it myself, sitting in the cold hall with the final signal in my ears. I would be lying if I said the old hate did not move in me when I heard the Vanguard Archon's contented cadence break. But the underreach did not rise to take a revenge. I have thought about this more than I have thought about anything else in a long life, and I have come to believe it is the truest thing about us, truer than the ships and the foundries and the long patient discipline. We did not spend 200,000 years in the dark in order to become, at the end of it, the thing that put us there. The creed was 3 lines, and the third line was the one that mattered most that night. We kept the dark. We kept the memory. We did not become a grave. We did not become a grave. The Ozrai were a grave-making people. They had looked at a living world and decided it would be more useful dead, and they had made it dead, and they had walked away content. The whole of the underreach, every gallery and every drill and every cold record of the weak years, had been built to ensure that we would never again be at the mercy of a grave-making people. But the records of the sundering were not kept so that we could learn to make graves ourselves. They were kept so that we would know, in our bones, exactly what it was we had decided never to become. So the High Command did not give the order to end them. The High Command gave a different order, and it was an order that no Archon in 200,000 years had ever received from a creature it had wronged. And it was, I think, the most human thing my people ever did. We hailed the Vanguard Archon Sehun on the open channel, in his own grammar, in a cadence we had built over 200,000 years from the cold records of his ancestors, and we gave him a choice. We told him what the arithmetic was. We did not threaten. We did not need to threaten, and threatening would have been a kind of cruelty, a way of making him beg. We simply laid the truth of it before him, ship against ship, The way you lay a settled account before a man who has lost a wager he did not know he had made. And then we told him he could leave. That was the order. Leave. Take your Vanguard and your markers and your survey instruments off the world you murdered and go back to the Ozrai Archonate and tell them what is here. Tell them there is something here that remembers. Tell them the world they scoured did not die, that it went into the dark and built, in 200,000 years of patience, the strength to unmake them at a word, and that it chose not to. Tell them the choosing was deliberate. Tell them we could have ended you in the first hour and did not, and let them sit with the meaning of that, because the meaning of that is the only warning worth giving a grave-making people. A people that would take a revenge can be understood by a people that takes revenges. A people that holds the power for a revenge and sets it down on purpose. That is a thing the Ozrai had no cadence for, and the lack of a cadence is a kind of fear that lasts longer than any wound. I listened to the channel while the command laid it out for him. I listened to the silence after, the long silence while the Vanguard Archon Sehun sat in his ship in our reclaimed sky and ran. I have no doubt, the arithmetic again, looking for the answer that was not there, the answer where he had some other choice. There was no other choice. He was precise enough to see that there was no other choice, which is why in the end the matter ended without a shot fired on either side. He gave the order to withdraw. The arrays caught it, and the cadence of it was the broken, improvised cadence of a creature doing the one thing left to it. And as near as our words can carry the shape of it, what he said to his vanguard was that they would lift, and that they would carry the record home, and that the reclamation was abandoned. And then, in a final clause that the archive has argued about ever since, a clause that strained his grammar to its breaking point, he said something that I have never been able to decide was an apology or only an accounting. He said that the holding had been misjudged. The holding had been misjudged. 200,000 years of his people's certainty, 200,000 years of my people's labor, and the Vanguard Archon Sehun reduced the whole of it in his last signal to a misjudged holding. Maybe that is all an apology is to a grave-making people. Maybe to admit you misjudged is the most an Ozrai mind can bend towards sorry. I have decided to let it be enough, because deciding otherwise costs me something I am too old to spend. They lifted. We let them lift. The ships of the Archon Vanguard rose off the murdered world they had come to claim, off the surface now bright with the works of the Underreach, and they turned their faces to the gulf of years they had crossed, and they went back into it. We tracked them out. The arrays held them all the way to the dark edge of the system, and past it, the way the watch had held everything for 200,000 years, and we did not lower the arrays until the last of the Vanguard was gone, and the high register went back to the wrongness-less silence we had known all our lives. And then the watch sounded the stand-down, the long, low note that no living person had heard outside of ceremony, the note that meant the sky was clear and the deep could rest, and across the whole of the Underreach, pole to pole, the calm machine that had risen folded itself back down, and the children came up from the deepest galleries, and it was over. It was over and we had not fired a shot. I think that is the part the surface-born find hardest to believe and the part I am proudest of, though pride is not quite the word. 200,000 years of getting ready to fight, and when the day came, the readiness was so complete that there was nothing left to fight. That is what readiness is at the end. It is not winning the battle. It is being so plainly, so overwhelmingly ready for the battle that the battle never has to happen, that the other side runs the arithmetic and stands down, and the only weapon you ever have to fire is the truth of what you have made of yourself in the dark. Kodal told me, the day they come back, nothing will happen that we have not already done 10,000 times in the dark. He was right, and he was more right than he knew, because the thing we had done 10,000 times in the dark and did once for real was not the firing. We never drilled the firing as the point. We drilled the rising, the showing, the laying of the account, the holding of the power and the setting of it down. The firing was only ever the thing we were ready to do if the showing failed. The showing did not fail. There was a cost. There is always a cost, and the surface-born who came up into the light and the open sky and the reclaimed world sometimes forget that the light was bought, and that the people who bought it did not live to spend it. The cost of the rising was not paid that night. The cost of the rising was paid across 200,000 years, in the weak years and after, in every builder who poured hull plate for ships they would never see fly, in every watch officer who died at an array having heard nothing but the dead silence his whole life, in every child taken deep in a drill that was never the real thing until the one time it was. Codal did not live to see the rising. My grandmother did not. There was a man named Halden who came up through the recruit halls beside me, who ran the dark seal at my shoulder for 30 years, until our hands knew each other's work in the black, and who took a watch officer's post on a forward array in the northern reach, and held it for the rest of his life, listening to the dead silence, and died at it 2 years before the Vanguard came back, having heard nothing in his whole career but the grind of the ice and the settling of the crust. I think of Halden more than I think of almost anyone. He gave his whole life to the listening and heard nothing, and that was not a wasted life, and the surface-born cannot always follow me when I say so. He was the watch. The watch is the man who listens his whole life and hears nothing and keeps listening, so that the one man in 200,000 years who finally hears something will have an array still pointed at the sky and an order of battle behind it. Halden built the night I lived through. He just did not get to be in it. Most of us did not get to be in it. The first builders, the ones who decided in the dark that we would not be a grave, they are 200,000 years of dust in galleries we no longer use. They paid for the night the Vanguard Archon Vanguard said the holding had been misjudged, and not one of them was there to hear him say it. That is the cost. It is a strange cost, paid forward across a span of time the mind cannot hold, and it is the only cost I know of that was paid entirely by the people who would never benefit from it, for the sake of people they would never meet, against an enemy they were never sure was coming. There is a word for that, and the word is not victory, though we won. The word is something older and harder, and I have spent my life inside it and still cannot say it cleanly. The nearest I can come is this. They kept the dark, and they kept the memory, and they did not become a grave, and they did it for us, who were not yet born, and we have to live in a way that is worth what they spent. I am very old now. I came up to the surface in the end, the way most of the deep-born did in the years after the rising, when it became clear the Ozrai were not coming back and the surface, slowly, under the patient hands of the same kind of people who had built the underreach, began to live again. I have stood on the open ground under an open sky for the first time in my long life, and I have felt the dead world come back, the new air thin and cold but real, the first green things taking hold in the glass the Archons made, and I have understood, standing there, why the first builders refused to be a grave. They wanted this, not the revenge, not even the strength, though the strength was necessary. They wanted the green to come back, and a sky over it, and people standing in the sky who remembered the dark and were not made cruel by it. That was the holding the Vanguard Archon Vanguard misjudged. He thought he had come back to a dead world. He had come back to people who had spent 200,000 years deciding in the dark exactly what they would be when they reached the light, and what they would be was this, ready and overwhelming and patient, and when the moment came that they held the power of a grave-making people in their hands, unwilling to use it. The strength was ours. The choosing was ours. The light is ours now, and the green and the open sky. I heard them come back. I heard the contented cadence break, and I heard the final signal of the Archon Vanguard, and I heard the holding called misjudged, and I have told it now as plainly as an old soldier can. There is nothing more to it than that, and there is everything more to it than that. We kept the dark. We kept the memory. We did not become a grave. And when the ones who buried us came back to admire their work, we were standing in the room in the light, and we let them go. And that is the whole of why I sleep at night under an open sky my ancestors never saw and will not see and bought anyway.